Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and so grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill and good faith. And remember, if you dig what we're doing here, please tell a friend about us. We're really easy to find at www.politicsandreligion.us. I think you need that www.politicsandreligion.us. When you tell somebody to tune in, that word of mouth is one of the most effective ways we have of growing our audience and including more people in this conversation. And with that, I am so excited about today's episode. We have two of the best political strategists in the country, Mike Madrid and Joe Trippi. Mike Madrid is a national political strategist and expert in demographics and Latino politics. Mike's academic work on Latino politics became the foundation for groundbreaking communications and outreach strategies in California, Texas, Florida, and nationwide. Later, Mike was a co-founder of the Lincoln Project, which played a significant part in defeating Donald Trump. Mike also lectures on race, class, and partisanship at USC, and he's a regular contributor on one of my favorite programs, Politicology, with Ron Steslow, where he famously has become known for having a very particular diet for breakfast, which we'll talk about. He is the co-host of an excellent and timely podcast, The Latino Vote, along with Chuck Rocha, who you may have heard here a few months ago on our show. And Mike also hosts a program, Mike Drop, on the Call-In app, which is then released as a podcast. Most notably, Mike Madrid, I think, is the first guest ever to score a hat trick on the TP&R pod. Did you know that, Mike?
No, I didn't know that.
It's kind of a big deal. Third time guest.
All right.
Our other guest, many may know, the rock star Joe Trippi. You can hear him on That Trippi Show, another really great podcast in the political realm. Joe's been running political campaigns at every level in U.S. politics and even internationally, starting in city politics in Northern California, and then jumping into the big leagues on Ted Kennedy's campaign for the Democratic nomination for president in 1980. Joe's also...
I'm really old.
I remember that campaign, actually. It's one of the first ones where I was, kind of paying attention. Although my dad, who you remember, we talked to him last time, he made sure that I was politically aware. So Joe's also been involved in some groundbreaking bottom-up strategies along the way, like when he ran Governor Howard Dean's grassroots presidential campaign in 2004. More recently, he helped Doug Jones, a Democrat, win the Alabama Senate seat, the first Democrat to get elected to the Senate in Alabama in decades. So just to underscore how good these guys are at what they do, one is the consultant who helped get a Democrat elected in a statewide race in Alabama, and our other guest helped get a Republican elected in a statewide race in California. These guys are the best. How are you guys doing? Mike, Joe, it's great to see you.
Good to be with you, man.
Yeah, it's really great to be on with you. I'm looking forward to the conversation today. This is going to be fun.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to jump right in and start by contextualizing where we are, not just in this campaign season, but more broadly speaking as a country. So I'd love if each of you could share what you believe is at stake in 2022, 2024, and beyond. Mike, since you're the old vet on TP&R, why don't you kick us off, and then Joe?
Sure. It's always good to be introduced with the adjective old, so I appreciate that. I mean, there's some wisdom in there, I hope.
Well, if I remember correctly, we're about the same age. In fact, we were maybe wrestling up against each other in high school.
Nothing wrong with being old, man. It just means you got something, to offer, at least I think. And so what I would offer is kind of this assessment is, look, we're in a period in American history where for the next probably decade, maybe 15 years or so, every national contest every 2 years is going to be extremely consequential. We're dealing with something that is a social problem, that is a cultural issue in our country, that is going to likely get worse before it gets better. And it's manifested itself in our political system, not surprisingly, as a representative government. And so this idea that we are, debating an old school style of politics about the role and scope and size of government and debating tax policy is really a secondary consideration until we get through this, what I think is basically a demographic bubble, which is demonstrative of a country going through something unprecedented. We've never become a non-white European country. That's a big part of what this is. This rise of kind of radicalism on the right has some clear racial connotations to it. We're also going through this extraordinary separation between the classes, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poor. That has, huge overtones in our society. We haven't experienced anything like it since the Gilded Age, which was a very tumultuous time in American history. And then technology, you throw in technology into this, and the way we self-segregate and self-isolate amongst communities of interest, it makes it extremely difficult for us to even agree on a set of facts, let alone what the solutions might be to the problems plaguing the country. And you've got this kind of perfect petri dish of really explosive, acerbic politics. And that's 2022. So at a 30,000 foot level, that's just kind of where I see things. And I like I said, I think we're in for a tough row. I think things get a little bit worse before they get better, but they will get better. We will get through it. And I think it'll be in large part because of people across party lines and across ideologies realizing that there's a greater good. And ultimately, I think that leads us to a better place as Americans.
What do you think, Joe?
Well, one, I'd agree with just about everything Mike just said. But I mean, I'd put it more, I think, and it's become like, a mantra, but democracy's on the ballot, period, in 2024. And I agree with Mike that fight over whether we maintain, sort of keep our democratic republic that we've been all this time is going to be on the ballot for the next 10. It's not going to, this isn't going to be a quick, defeat the authoritarian right in 2022 and wow, or beat Trump in 2020 and man, it's all going to go away. That didn't happen. It's not going to happen for a lot of the reasons deep down that Mike talked about and listed. But what is going on with it as tribalism and hatreds sort of reemerge? Part of the reason that's happening is because the sense of common purpose, of national purpose, has diminished over time to the point where it's, there are a lot of things in the Constitution, Bill of Rights that talk about rights, not a whole lot in either about responsibility of citizens to find common ground, to put, sort of the struggle between a common purpose and my unfettered individual liberty and freedom. Those two things have been in constant tension between them throughout our country, but we were always able to find the common purpose that got beyond, hey, don't tell me what to do, don't tell me to wear a mask or whatever the hey, I have a right to do it my way. That's because there's been a decline in national purpose. I think it's meant the rise of tribalism. It's meant the rise of these hatreds that have been out there. Many of us didn't think it was as big as it is. It's big, and it's not going away. And we have to find a way. I mean, I agree with Mike too that it's not over. We can come back from this, but it's going to require all of us to talk with each other again. Mike and I have always been able to do that, even when we're on, opposite sides. But the time for, arguing, as he says, about like getting back to the old arguments of marginal tax rates and things like that, those are a ways off, man. That's why we're both on, part of the pro-democracy coalition to defeat this. We can have those arguments and fights later on. unfortunately, the one thing that scares me the most is how oblivious many Americans are to the real threat. And that's because there's a normalcy bias. I mean, we've been this great country for over 250 years. It can't happen here, even though the same kind of feeling that, Trump could never happen here. He could never get elected. Well, he did. That January 6th could never happen in America. Well, it did. And now you're still, even with all that, the authoritarian movement can never take power in America. That can never happen here. Well, that's how democracy dies. And the real question is, can enough, and with very little leadership among Republican electeds to sort of cue that's what's going on here, folks. This is wrong. We got to step away from it. In fact, they're enabling it. So that enables that bias, that normalcy bias is there, and people want to buy into it. No one wants to believe that this democratic republic is failing and going to fail in a way that could lead to authoritarian movement taking it over. And that's part of what we're up against here in 2022. I mean, so a lot of the arguments, a lot of the negative ads about crime or inflation or immigration are going to work if you're an American who thinks these are normal times. It's a normal election between two functioning parties. Unfortunately, it's not. There's only one functioning pro-democracy party still in America. The other one has been taken hostage by an authoritarian MAGA cult movement, and it's strong, and it's well funded. And I mean, you just look at these races where Herschel Walker is in it in Georgia. I mean, despite everything, it's a lot like the Trump thing. Where shoot somebody in Times Square, Fifth Avenue, and get away with it. Right now, this movement is so strong that they will ignore just about anything to take power.
You bring up a number of interesting points, and I normally on this program don't get into 24-hour headlines, but there have been some developments just in the last 24 hours. We're recording this on a Tuesday, 5 weeks out of Election Day, and you brought up Herschel Walker. Yeah. There was, I think, Mike, you referred to it as it's Oppo dump time of the campaign season. So we found out that Dr. Oz, the Republican Senate candidate in Pennsylvania, not only doesn't have an affinity for dogs, he has an affinity for killing dogs, apparently. Or we watched just in the last day or so, Ron DeSantis mimicked a very Trumpian trick of basically pushing volunteer recovery workers out of the way for a photo op. And yet, you mentioned Herschel Walker, a woman that he impregnated literally has the receipts of him paying her to get an abortion. And yet, as you experienced in the Doug Jones campaign, Roy Moore had certain revelations that came out throughout the campaign, and yet his support remains strong. So maybe this is more of a sociological question. Why is that? How can that be? And how do you break through on a campaign, like shake people by the lapels? Like, why is that? And how do you break through?
Well, in the Alabama race, so bizarre watching all the talking heads on cable, say after the Washington Post story, that got into the accusations of Roy Moore and several underage women, et cetera. I mean, what the accusations were at the time, and everybody on cable was proclaiming he was dead. I mean, absolutely dead. Our own polling showed him surge 4 points when that story broke. We had been down by a point. We were tracking at the time, so it just happened to be able to spot this, but we were literally behind him by a point. And with none of the scandal stuff, we'd already closed it to a point. And then the scandal broke. Everybody thought he was dead, and he went up by 4 or 5 points on us almost immediately. And what it was the Washington elites out to destroy him. They were lying about the Washington elites were like, if it had maybe been an Alabama paper that broke the story, maybe there'd be a difference. But it was the Washington Post, and then you had him and Trump and the entire Republican, outrage machine go into this is the elites trying to corrupt. It's that, all the stuff that the outrage machine is able to spew. They were, and they did. And in the end, though, there were enough Republican women. There aren't a lot of suburbs in Alabama, but there were Republican women, younger Republicans, college-educated Republicans, that barely enough, by the way. We only won by 23,000 votes. Now, it was Alabama, though. And so, look, I think that's what we have to hope for. That I think in terms of going into 2022, that there are enough Republicans, even though it's maybe only 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points, could be more, but who, Republican women upset with the Dobbs decision. And by the way, I saw this in Alabama too. There were we had focus groups where we did focus groups with pro-life women, and this is 2017, way before where we are today with Dobbs. And they literally would talk about that they were very pro-life, but they had serious doubts about whether it made sense to overthrow and change Roe v. Wade. That maybe we could find ways to work together to reduce it, but just totally overturning that had some angst about it. This was in 2017. So I think there are things that are happening out there. And again, like the Herschel Walker thing, does that help move the 2 or 3 points of, Republican women, younger Republicans who who really have problems with sort of the homophobic and racist and other elements that they're seeing, and the authoritarian movement that they're seeing. So I think in a lot of ways, as worried as I am that democracy's on the ballot and we may not succeed at stopping them enough in 2022. I do think we may. I'm one of the few people out there who still think the Democrats have maybe a 50-50 chance of holding on to the House. And I know that's blasphemy, and people go, you're out of your mind. But I do, just from that experience of and the numbers I'm seeing, I do think it's possible that, maybe Democrats lose the House by 10 seats, or we hold it by 2 or 3. But I think it's going to be in that kind of range, not the 20 or 30 or 40 that people were talking about in the beginning of the year, because of these factors. Because I think there are the number of extreme candidates that they've nominated on the other side, and the number of I think that number of Republicans who are having grave problems with sort of the authoritarian side of the party. I think we're starting to see that grow a little bit. Not big numbers. The MAGA crowd is still there, still powerful, and is going to win a hell of a lot of these seats. But I think it may be enough that we eke it out.
So you bring up some interesting points, and I'd like to zoom out again for a second and talk about the mechanics of a campaign. I'm curious, Mike, at any given stage in a campaign, what are some of the factors that you weigh to help you gauge whether a candidate's standing, where the candidate stands in relation to their opponent? More big picture first, then maybe we can talk about some specific races.
Well, that's an enormously broad question. So, I guess the best way to ask it or answer it is to kind of, let's talk about Herschel Walker and where he's at in Georgia at this moment in time, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because I think this is a real test of a campaign professional's mettle right here, both Democrats and Republicans. You have to really have a cool head at this moment on either side of this on how to play something this explosive. There's 2 things I'm convinced of. One is, to Joe's point, Herschel Walker is not out of the race. This is
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be surprised if you saw polling similarly to what he was seeing in Alabama that would show a consolidation of the Republican vote even a little bit more immediately. And then, maybe a week or 2 later, you could start to see some dissolution of it. But conventional wisdom right now on social media and on cable shows is this race is over. I don't believe that for a second. Okay. but I'm also convinced that there's more news coming. Right? It's kind of like the Moore race in Alabama, right? It's October 3rd is when the story broke. Okay. And the thing about Oppo is we've gotten so good at it is you don't dump your best stuff first, right? You build up to it, right? You put the candidate in trouble. And this is a very deeply flawed candidate. This candidate's going to go through the mill right now. And what they're deciding literally this morning is, okay, our candidate has probably lied to us, right? We've got to win this race despite the candidate. His natural inclination is going to be to lie about it because he's freaked out and he's scared. If he lies about it, we know that more information is going to come out showing that he's lying. So you've got a really tough decision as a campaign professional to make right now. You got to sit your client down and say, look, man, okay, look, we're at where we're at. I know you haven't been cleaning up front with us before, but you're going to have to, we've got a decision. We either double down on the lie and try and ride that out, or you come out and you ask for forgiveness and say that you did this and try to make some amends with both your family and the public. The problem with both of those strategies is, like I said, there's a month left in this race. And if anybody thinks that this is the biggest bomb that's going to drop, you're wrong. There's more coming. And so they really don't have a good place to be as the Republicans. As if I'm Warnock, I stay away from everything. Just get the hell out of the way. Get away from the explosion.
So let me just ask a few specific questions in this. And Joe, maybe this is where you're going. But as a practitioner, are you focusing on not leaking, in this case, the MAGA base, or do you think there's still an opportunity to persuade? I was going to ask you both about the Bannon line voters, or are you still thinking there's a chance to win over enough of those Bannon line voters, those persuadable independent voters, those undecideds, if there are any left? Where's your focus on making sure that you're plugging the leaks, or still the possibility of persuading some of those Bannon line voters?
I think that they're not going to leak any MAGA voters. That's not going to happen. The MAGA voters, this won't matter to them. Nothing matters. It's just it's just like any way they can stick it to the elites, defeat the socialist Democrats, whatever the hell the outrage machine is pushing this week. And by the way, Mike's right about the Oppo, but there'll be another outrage tomorrow. That the outrage machine goes crazy on Democrats and Warnock and everybody for. So both those things are going to play out. I do think that this doesn't help Walker at all with the Bannon line voters. I mean, again, those Republican women who were voicing in the focus groups we saw in Alabama that they had concerns about whether Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned, I suspect are some of the votes that have been leaking over, to the Democratic side. I don't see how hypocrisy on this, I mean, personal hypocrisy of, denying it or admitting it and asking for forgiveness, that may be a better way to win some of those Bannon line voters back. But that might risk, asking forgiveness is not a good thing in MAGA world. So that could be the question. I mean, if you're sitting down as a consultant or a strategist for Herschel Walker, this is why this could be really explosive and tough for him, because they go one way, they could win those Bannon line voters, bring some of them back and get past Warnock. On the other hand, doing that might create a bunch of MAGA folks to say, oh, hell, he's too weak. He asked for forgiveness. Oh, my God, that's disgusting. That's horrible. Using words that Trump would use in the situation. And so that's interesting. I do agree with Mike too, though, that, Warnock, it's like, look, when somebody's blowing themselves up, don't get in their way, just sort of keep to your plan and let them decide which part of the limb they want to saw off here. Cause I don't see how they handle this in a way that doesn't impact one way or another, the Bannon line or the MAGA cult.
So, I mean, this is such an interesting case study, and there's a lot of really interesting, closely held races. But how do you, as a strategist, decide how to deploy your resources? I'm assuming that some campaigns you have more limited resources than others. but you have to. It's almost like you have to pick your poison. Saw off a limb, or try to avoid the explosion, or is there something strategic and potentially effective that you can do? How do you make those decisions?
Well, every situation, of course, is different, right? Every battlefield is different, but there are some basic metrics that you look at. And again, we use military parlance in campaigns because they're not that different. The strategic tactics of a campaign comes from a military campaign. The battlefield changes in every fight, and you have to adjust accordingly. And that's what makes a good general, right? Is to know the fundamentals of the race. This race is a little bit different. And I think, again, Joe and I are pretty much in simpatico on everything that we're seeing, and at least at this moment in time. What I will say is that a little bit unique. And again, we're not even 24 hours out of this big bombshell. Again, this podcast will come out after a few days and other decisions are made. But at the moment, like when you're in the middle of this, when this bomb drops, I think what's different is you didn't really start to see the narrative change and from feedback on the ground in Georgia with Republicans until his son, Christian Walker, jumped into this thing.
Yeah. Okay.
If this had just been a Daily Beast story, they would have handled it the way that they handled it, which is Walker goes out and he denies it on Fox. Right. And this is the establishment, and they're going to lie. This never happened. And then his son comes out, who's an influencer in his own right, and says, bullshit, this is all a big lie.
Right.
Now, at that point, it's a whole different calculation. Because he's this massive variable that you don't have in most other scenarios. It would be like a Don Jr. or an Ivanka Trump coming out and saying, Dad's a liar, he's a crook, he's a thief, you all know it, it's true, here's the deal, right? That would change the dynamic and the trajectory of the media narrative, because now they've got to crawl back. And right-wing media, the Fox Newses of the world, the Free Beacons of the world, all of these guys are already trying to do damage control and give them an audience and try to allow the campaign to express their way out of it. They're in a real conundrum right now. And when we look, I coined the term the Bannon line.
Yeah.
To refer to that 4 to 5% of Republican women that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. The reason why I use that language, the Bannon line, was because it wasn't just Mike Madrid saying it, it wasn't just Democratic operatives saying it, it wasn't just the left saying it. It was Steve Bannon who was acknowledging that they have to have 100% unity in the base to be competitive as a party. It's why Republicans treat apostates and turncoats like the Lincoln Project guys or Liz Cheney as like worse than the devil. Like there's the devil is bad, but underneath the doormat of the devil is where we are, right? Like we're those.
Yeah.
And the reason is because you have to keep conformity in a cult. The most damaging thing to a cult is the people who leave and say it's a cult, right? And so they have to drive that person out as an apostate. It's the same thing with voters. So one of the effective things about organizations that go in and are trying to peel out these Republican voters, it's an offensive strategy. We're not going after independents or conservative leaners. You're going into it, chipping into the base, and you're hammering, as you've seen the Lincoln Project do, right? Quite effectively. Right. And all you're trying to do is peel off a couple of chips. Yeah. Because without those chips, it's mathematically impossible for the Republican to win. And that's why this moment is important, right? And this Republican women, this Bannon line demographic, it's generally a college-educated suburban woman voter. Not always, but that's the bulk of them. They are not comfortable with the party's Confederate posturing. They're not comfortable with the party's abortion stuff. They're not comfortable with the hard line, ugly, hardcore cultural messaging that's anti-homophobic, that's racist, that's just ugly. They like the tax cuts. They like the country club part of it. That's why they're Republican. They have never been really comfortable with the cultural drift of the Republican Party. And as it gets more extreme, they're losing that voter on the margins. And the job is to go in there and hammer it, not to persuade them and to convince them that our policies are better. It's really to ostracize and shame the shit out of them, to say, you're not comfortable in the country club setting anymore. standing next to a bunch of Confederate soldiers. Like, that's who you are.
And the thing that happens though, when you look at, because I've seen a bunch of, done a bunch of focus groups on this stuff. These women, a lot of them have never voted for anybody but the Republican Party for their entire lives. And so you can see them sort of have this reckoning with themselves. Literally, they start to stare down at their shoes and start muttering that they can't believe that maybe for the first time in their life, as they and they spit out the word Democrat, like it's poison for the, and they're like, yeah, and it's and so I agree with Mike. I one that's going on, but that's part of the barrier. The brand of the Democratic Party has been so poisoned with these people for so long, decades, by the outrage machine, whatever, and mistakes the party's made. I'm not saying absolution for anybody, but that's the barrier, right? It's their perception of the brand that they've despised for so long. They're starting to really have deep problems with the Republican Party, and it's that if they get through that barrier, that's the Bannon line voter. That's the voter who says, "Now, damn it, maybe I'm only going to date these turkeys for a year or two, or a cycle or two, but I can't be with this party right now. I'm going to vote Democratic." But it's a struggle for them internally to get there, and that's why I think Mike's right, that constant sort of pounding on what this party's become, on is this really who you are,
right?
Really asking those questions opens up an off-ramp, a way to come over. And I think that Bannon line has grown. I mean, I know it was 3 or 4 points in the 2020 election. I think it may have grown now to 7, 8, somewhere up there, in a place where it can make a bigger difference. And the other thing, look, these places that we're talking about, like Georgia, I mean, the reality is there's Pennsylvania, Ohio, with Biden's numbers being where they're at. These guys should be getting creamed by 10 points. We're not should be sitting in the low 40s, basically, praying for lightning or something, a miracle to happen. It's not happening, because I think this decoupling has happened in this election, where it's not about a referendum on the president. It really is a choice between these two parties and their candidates. They've gone MAGA, and there will be the usual attacks about how extreme the left is and the Democrats are. But I think they're really bleeding Bannon line voters right now. And that may be it. That's why I keep going back to my view that the House side of this will be closer than people think, because this is all happening in the same country, right? These Senate races. Look, none of us think a race in California, anybody but a Democrat's going to win it for Senate. Idaho, no one but a Republican. So then when you get to where these battleground states are for Senate races, where are they? Pennsylvania, Ohio, Nevada. Same thing. Throw out all the bright red House districts, throw out all the bright blue House districts, you get to 32, 33 toss-ups. They're a lot closer to what's going on in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia. If that same bleeding is going on with the Bannon line voters in those toss-up races, I think people will be surprised by, not that we take the House. I'm not predicting that, but I'm saying I think it can happen, and that we're a lot stronger. The pro-democracy side of this is a lot stronger because of those Bannon line voters that may come across too in the House races.
So much of what you're saying makes sense. I always picture the Bible study class, the Sunday school class I went to for 10, 15 years at Grace Baptist Church. And there's about 10, 15 couples in that class. So 20, 30 people in there. It was a young marriage class when I used to be young. But, listen, the Bannon line is defined, as you're describing it, by the women in that room, college educated, suburban, historically Republican voting women. Almost always Republican voting women. And listen, you're not gonna persuade that entire room, but there's at least 1, 2, 3 of those women in that room, and I know them, that are persuadable. But what you're saying, Joe, and I've heard Rick Wilson talk about this too, the Bannon line isn't 2 or 3. The Bannon line can be expanded. He was saying as much as 10 to 12. I've heard him say. So who are those other Bannon line voters, and is it the same in every district? Because every district has its own nuanced constituency. So who are they if it's not just 2 or 3? Who are the other ones, and how do you reach them? How do you persuade them?
Well, I think it's different in a lot of places.
Yeah,
but the obvious places I think are the women that Mike and I've talked about, that sort of are the base of that group. Younger Republicans, I think, are there. That's a growing group, particularly after Dobbs' decision. Some of them are motivated by the extreme. They believe the party's too extreme on a whole bunch of things, race and a bunch of other things. They like the tax cuts, they like fiscal conservative, all those things, but that's the party's gone off the rails on things they do care about, including some of them climate change. So I think that group, younger Republicans, I think too, the weird one, there are a bunch of weird things now because of what these guys have been doing. I mean, the Ukraine-Russia thing, I mean, there are a lot of Republicans, older Republicans too, that have, viewed Russia as the big threat, enemy of America, and suddenly their party, Trump and Tucker Carlson, and by the way, just like clockwork, 94% of them are sitting there going, yeah, why are we standing up to Putin? Why are we doing Ukraine? But there's a group, I think, that is starting to really wonder about, what's happened to that strong, party that stood up, Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
that's happening. And the other one is Venezuelans and folks like that in places like Florida, where just the stupid stunt of sending those folks to Martha's Vineyard, Mike's the expert on this stuff for sure, on that community. But it's different everywhere. A Mexican American in Texas is different from a Venezuela, somebody who escaped from Venezuela, and how they react to this, to that stunt, can cost you votes in Florida. And I don't know if those campaigns there are going to be that tight, but I mean, there's different factions that I think for bizarre reasons, they're breaking off little as Mike said, you just bang it and chip. So banging on that community. You talked about how do you spend your money? Well, right now I'd be spending a lot of money digitally and on radio, going at Venezuelan community in Florida, because you can reach them digitally. I mean, there's ways to reach people differently than. By the way, that's the one thing I think the mistake, and I think Mike might agree with me on this, is the big mistake these campaigns are doing is spending so much money on television, where it's just a zero-sum game. I mean, after you get to saturation, more saturation doesn't do anything. A lot of these messages, you could be going at some of these Bannon line women in the suburbs with online and digital and other things, and same with the different groups within the Hispanic community with different arguments for in different states, but it's different everywhere.
I love seeing, so I'm in California 27, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, but I love seeing Mike Garcia ads in this district because, and Mike, I think we talked about this at one point, but in order to run TV here, you have to pay so much money to air in a part of this region that has nothing to do with California 27. So he's literally blowing money away. And by the way, the ads themselves are just weak. Like that's all you got on Christy Smith. So I kind of like seeing Garcia ads on TV because I know it's such a inefficient use of their funds. And whoever he has making those ads, man, I'm never going to introduce them to my friends in in strategic creative advertising, because they could do, in their sleep they could make a more effective ad. But Mike, you sound, it looks like you have something to respond to Joe. Tell him where he's wrong.
No, he's not wrong. I mean, there's a couple things. The running broadcast in LA, real quickly, running broadcast in LA is incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
It's the most expensive waste of money possible. But what it really tells you is that's how much money they have, and there's probably no more inventory left. So there's kind of this mythology about campaigns running out of money. Like, that doesn't happen. There will be money. Both sides in a competitive race, they will find the money. Somehow there is going to be the money there. And it's really more, it's not a sign really of wasted money. It's a sign of no more inventory left. And so they're willing to spend a gazillion dollars for a 30-second ad that only 14 people literally are probably their target to try to get to move over in raw numbers. It's incredibly inefficient, but I wouldn't suggest that it's a sign of bad tactics. It's just a sign of there's more money coming into a district like that, and there's nowhere else to spend it. And that's important, because it is a good segue to talk about we are in some ways conflating the idea of the Bannon line with persuadable voters.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I agree with that.
The Bannon line can't go to 13. That's not what that is, right? What we're really saying is the nature of the Republican coalition is changing. One of the most profound discussions I had was in the end of the 2020 cycle, because I was the guy doing the math and the targeting for the Lincoln Project. Is Stuart Stevens asked a great question. He said, Mike, everything that you're saying is a little bit different than what we've ever done on a campaign before. Let me ask you one broad question, and it's a question I'll never forget. He said, if you were to run our closing narrative here, the Lincoln Project's closing narrative, if it's going to be on economic or cultural issues with our base voters, which would it be? And immediately I said cultural. And he kind of sat back and said, that's interesting. And I realized how profound it was, because in 30 years of my professional career, I had never said that either. And he was aware of it. That's not the way we have ever talked about wedging off our own Republican issues with our own base. But that's what was happening, is the Republican Party, and this is really to Trippi's another piece, data point to make his case on the potential competitiveness of the House. I don't believe in the generic ballot as a good indicator anymore. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe in presidential approval as a good indicator anymore. Let me tell you what I think is the most hidden metric that nobody is paying attention to. And very few pollsters even ask this question, but those that do, you can see exactly what's going on. And that is, which party do you think is the most extreme?
Oh, yeah.
And Republicans are kicking the crap out of Democrats on that metric. Wow. Like, the average American thinks the Republican Party is more extreme. And in an era of negative partisanship, that's the metric to look at.
Yeah,
that's the data point that none of these people are looking at. And so the reason is because people are more inclined to vote against things than for things in this environment. And you vote against extremes, right? You're rejecting extremes. So when Joe is saying this demographic is more in play than people think, I think he's right. He's exactly right. For that reason, is the Republican Party at this point in time is viewed markedly more extreme. Right. And they're losing their college-educated base on our own issues. As Republicans, is what we used to run to consolidate the base, is now pushing them away. That's a sign that there's a problem in the Republican base.
So here's the thing that makes this sort of takes us to the fore. So you go look at New York 19, right? Molinaro is not, one of the crazier cult MAGA folks, right? And Ryan defeats him by outperforming Biden in Democratic performance in the district, which I think, again, gets to Mike's point that the party now, the extremism in the party is now tainting even candidates who aren't, card-carrying MAGA cult members. That's how that's why the explanation for Ryan defeating Molinaro. Now, take that to the next step. So we've had 5 special elections in the House this year. All 5 Democrats have outperformed Democratic performance in Biden. I mean, Biden may have lost the district by 14 and the Democrat lost it by 7 in the House special. But I mean, so we didn't win them all, but we've outperformed everywhere. So there are 222 districts in America today that have a higher Democratic performance than New York 19.
Oh.
So why is it? This is why when you put what Mike said, the sort of extremism of the party, it's starting to taint everything. You have evidence in those 5 races, New York 19 being the most recent, and we outperform there. And there's 222 districts that have better Democratic performance than New York 19, but it's going to be a wipeout, folks. We're just dead. It's going to be 20 because it's a midterm and everybody knows what happens in midterms. That's what's going on. It's crazy.
Yeah, the prognosticators are using the same tools that they've been using for 30 years. The generic ballot it's a data point, but it just because it's been correlate with outcomes doesn't mean it's caused it.
Yeah.
Right. And that what Joe is saying is right, is people are looking at the same data that they have been, and it's not producing the same outcomes. And so I just look at data a little bit differently. And I think there's a lot of merit to what Joe is saying. And if you look through the lens of negative partisanship, you start to understand why Joe's right about the Democrats overperforming the model over and over, even though they're not crushing the Republicans in the generic ballot.
Right.
Or Biden's numbers were sitting in the high mid 30s when the Democrats are overperforming in New York 19 and overperforming in the Nebraska special election. It's like, why, if the data is not matching what's happening on the ground, maybe the data is not a good reflection anymore. And that's when you look at the Cook Report or Sabato's crystal ball and all these guys, it's like they're using the same metrics that they were using in the 80s. I don't mean to be.
I looked at it as an old stock operator, because I saw this, the first thing that was often talked about in the upcoming midterms, as far back as a year and a half ago, was the historical trend that the party in power loses seats, gets wiped out in the first midterm in a new president's term. But that's just a technical data point, and there have been exceptions to that technical data point. When the fundamentals don't match the technical, then we have to start questioning. And Joe, you've been talking about this for months. I heard you on an interview with Bill Kristol where you did start talking about the fundamentals. But I know we're short on time, so I want to ask you. I was going to ask you about one point where I think you disagree, and that is, Joe, you talked about on the Trippi show that came out this morning. You had 2 guests that were talking about Tim Ryan's campaign in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And that one tactic he's deploying is going into the rural parts of the state to persuade voters or maybe to minimize the score that he'll be outperformed, that he'd typically be outperformed there. Mm-hmm. So one is, do you find his time in the rural part of the state to be effective? And then if so, Mike, tell him why he's wrong. Because I know on Mike Drop, you've railed against this strategy that Beto has been trying, that it's a waste of time.
Well, first of all, they're 2 different places and they're different candidacies. I think the reason it works for Ryan is because J.D. Vance is not like some rural blue collar Republican. He just reeks of being a VC and tech entrepreneur who's distant, hasn't been seen, has sort of been missing in action the whole campaign. And so I think and Tim Ryan is a blue collar guy. I mean, he's a real deal guy. Yeah, a lot of ways, the same way Fetterman may appeal to some people in the T in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, it's Philly, Pittsburgh, and Alabama in between, and the T is Alabama. And I think Fetterman can appeal there vis-a-vis the same thing. Dr. Oz, phony, carpetbagger. I mean, so I think those 2 races, that strategy is trying to appeal and talk to those voters, I think is a good one. Maybe the margin, both of them need to win in Ohio and Pennsylvania as those races are going to get closer. They always do. And Beto's a different situation, and both he and Abbott known entities. I'm not sure Mike and I would disagree too much about Ohio or Texas. They're totally two different places in term, and not just. I'm not talking just geographically. I'm talking about the difference between the contrast between the two candidates is a different contrast, I think.
Well, before you respond, Mike, can I keep you for an extra couple minutes, because I know Joe has to take off?
Yeah.
I have one last question for you, Joe, and then I appreciate.
Yeah,
your
I'm
time.
sorry. I'm sorry. I have to.
That's okay. That's okay. We love having you as long as we can. So I'm going to ask for some free advice, since I'm a California 27 honk. It is one of the more closely held races in the country. I don't know how familiar you are. Mike Garcia, is about as MAGA as they come. He tried to run as a centrist, but his voting record, all of his public statements indicate that he is just playing to the most extreme MAGA part of his party. So if you were to be able to, number one, who is persuadable in this district? What would you say to a candidate and a campaign? What should they be doing to persuade those last persuadables here? Because in the last election, Christie, who's running again, Christie Smith, lost by 333 votes, 0.1% of the electorate. So what are some of the things that you can be doing at this stage, 5 weeks left, to maximize the folks who are going to vote for you, to maximize the turnout, but maybe for those last few 333 voters, what would you be saying to them, and what would you be doing to persuade them to come over?
I don't think the campaign itself has much ability to persuade people to come over at this point. I would concentrate my campaign on getting my folks out. I would encourage volunteers and people in the campaign to reach out to their friends, neighbors, and coworkers who might that they may have stopped talking to the last couple of years, and actually take them out to coffee. And peer-to-peer is more likely to get one of those people to break off and decide to vote, to date Democrats for a couple, for this cycle and next. I don't think a campaign at this stage is going to be able to do that. Much more important at this stage, I think, to concentrate on turning your vote out, and where you can, encouraging people to start talking to their friends and neighbors about why they should leave the Republican Party for one or two elections and help save democracy.
So an emphasis on the grassroots, an emphasis on the turnout campaign, turning voters out. So I know you got to go, but before you go, how can folks find you online and that Trippi show and all the great work that you're doing?
At Joe Trippi on Twitter is probably the best place to find out what I'm up to. And of course, that Trippi show, appreciate a listen. I think you'll like the guests we have on, and find it anywhere you find this podcast.
Sure thing. TRIPPI. Joe, it's great seeing you. Yeah. It's great hanging out with you again. I hope you don't wait as long for the next time.
No, it's great being with you. And Mike and I have been, like, we were just talking before we came on about how long it's been since we've been in the same spot, or at least seeing each other on Zoom. It's great to be with you guys. It was really a great conversation. Thanks, guys.
You bet. Thanks, Joe.
Take care.
All right, Mike. So do you want to respond to that?
It's not really a response. It's just Joe's right. I mean, geography really matters. But I will say this, and let me again. I don't want to geek out too much, but I'm a geek, and that's, I think, why people probably tune into the show. So let's get under the hood a little bit.
Sure.
Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania were the three states he mentioned. And let's just rewind a little bit for the listeners.
Okay.
But basically, the argument is, should Democrats be going into rural, deep red, deep MAGA counties and trying to peel off votes, a handful of Republican votes, in order to diminish these big margins that Republicans are getting in winning races? And Joe's right. In some places, it might make sense. It might make more sense in Ohio. And I'm going to say might, okay? Mm-hmm. It might make more sense in Ohio because of the unique dynamics of that race. Tim Ryan is a particularly good candidate and JD Vance is a particularly bad candidate. Okay. It's not often that those two dynamics meet. And so it may make a lot of sense. In fact, the math may require Ryan to go into those districts in Ohio. So in Ohio, I can give him a pass there.
Okay.
Let's talk about Texas, because I've been a very big critic of Beto's campaign, because this is where they've put a lot of emphasis and time and messaging. I think it makes no sense in Texas. And the reason is because the way you win Texas statewide, of course, is by, as a Democrat, is you have to close the gap with white suburban voters. He's talking to white rural voters, which are the most conservative of the conservative voters out there. Now, there's an argument that what he's trying to do is put out the imagery that he can talk to everybody, and he's a different kind of Democrat because he can win over white conservatives in the rural part of Texas, and that makes him more open and amenable and softens his hard Democratic edges with GOP women, and are like, okay, if some of those rural whites can, go with him, then I guess I can go with them. But the truth of the matter is, in campaigns, you go fishing where the fish are, especially fish that are going to eat your bait. And those fish aren't eating his bait. There's not enough voters. There's not enough fish for Beto to be getting in these deep MAGA counties. Bad strategy. I don't think he's going to get there. And I think his campaign's going to have some answering to do in the postmortem to say, why were you spending that much time there when there just was not enough yield to get for what you were investing time and resources on?
So you're saying instead of going 6 hours west of Austin, you'd go 30, 45 minutes north of Austin to Pflugerville, or 30, 45 minutes north of Dallas to Plano. And those are the fish that are ready to bite, more so than the ones in West Texas.
Shouldn't leave anywhere more than 45 minutes out of the core of any one of the urban centers in Texas.
Houston, Dallas.
That's it. And instead of doing two events in rural, Okefenokee County up by the Oklahoma border or whatever, you should be spending doing 6 events in the burbs outside of Austin.
Yeah.
You just spend more time, more effort, more energy, more resources, create more of a buzz. You're going to raise more money. You're going to drive more message to a constituency that's actually going to get you where you need to go. And I think that's one of the tactical mistakes that the Beto campaign has made to this point. Now, the in between those two is Pennsylvania. Can I switch over there real quick?
Sure.
Again, just hardcore geeking out, but we're in that point in the cycle.
Yeah.
Fetterman has this imagery of kind of being a blue collar guy. And he looks very blue collar, right? He talks very blue collar, and especially when Oz is kind of this, New Jersey out of state multi-gazillionaire who eats crudité. Like they've framed him so well. But here's what's fascinating. Fetterman is actually doing worse in rural parts of Pennsylvania than he is in the urban core. He's not the imagery of who he's perceived to be and what the data is actually saying is not the same. And what you have to understand about Pennsylvania is exactly what Trippi just mentioned. Pennsylvania, if it's a rectangle, in the lower left-hand corner is Pittsburgh, in the lower right-hand corner is Philadelphia. Right. If you take those two squares out, it leaves what looks like a T. And that's what we call the T. And the T in Pennsylvania is very rural. It's like upper New York. It's like eastern Ohio. It's very rural, very poor, very white, very non-college educated, not a lot of economy there. Okay. Not a lot of, there's no high tech moving to the T in Pennsylvania. And that is deep MAGA country. That's where Trump dramatically overperformed. And so the argument of going into the T to suppress or peel off that hardcore MAGA vote is a tactical decision that every campaign needs to make. I don't believe Democrats are their best messengers there. I spent millions of dollars on the Lincoln Project peeling off votes in Erie County, Pennsylvania, and it worked because we were using Republican messengers talking to other Republicans and saying, this is not your party, and this is where at least this one time, this is where you ought to go. That is not a message that Democrats are good at conveying, not because they're bad people, but because they're Democrats. It's the same reason you don't put a Republican into an urban Black precinct in the last month of the campaign. It's not because they're bad people. It's because you're not going to get enough votes out of there. No matter how hard you work at it, there's just not enough votes. And even if you got them, there's not enough to make a difference for what you're trying to accomplish. And so that's the problem with Democrats is it's just, I think it's a bad strategy to go and peel off a handful of smattering of rural white votes because it's so labor intensive. It's so difficult to get to. And even if you're successful, you're not getting the amount of votes that you need to win.
So to apply your Texas strategy to Pennsylvania, that would be Bucks County, for example.
Yeah. Exactly.
When I drive up the River Road, whenever I go visit, one of my favorite places in the country, by the way, I drive up the River Road to New Hope. Each election cycle, I'm looking for those signs out in the big green yards. Right? Yeah.
You see Trump signs out there.
Well, yeah, you did it. You certainly did in
yeah, they're kind of faded now, but you definitely, and that was one of the signs in 2016.
Yeah.
Is consultants were saying, Republican consultants were calling me saying, Trump's going to win Pennsylvania. And I was like, you're out of your mind. Like, Pennsylvania has not gone Republican since 1988.
Yeah.
And they were like, something is happening here.
It's so funny. I had this drive from, I was driving out from New Orleans, but driving back to Austin. So I had that it's semi-rural drive between Houston and Austin. And that was October of 2020. And I thought, man, I know some of the polls are saying that it's really close here and Biden has a chance. But based on the signs on that road from Houston to Austin, ain't no way. Yeah,
and we get caught in our media bubbles too, especially as Californians or New Yorkers or whatever social media is. We just can't imagine like that's a real thing. And like, how could that be possible? And you don't realize that when you look through the mirror, there's red voters looking at the exact same direction, saying the exact same things. How can people vote for Joe Biden? Like what media do they listen to? What world are they in?
Yeah.
And as committed as blue state blue voters are, there's this lack of recognition that their counterparts are equally as committed, equally as focused, equally as siloed on their candidates and their party and their view of the world. And because we don't talk, because as I said in the intro, because we don't share common platforms or common neighborhoods anymore, there's no agreement on even what the issues of the day are, let alone how to solve them.
Yeah. So a couple more questions. One, again, I'm so myopic at California 27, but I think it is one of those small handful of districts that is really closely held. And it may be one of the ones that a lot of folks are looking to get a gauge on which way the election is going on November 8th. So what would you say to Christy Smith's campaign managers and Christy Smith herself in these last 5 weeks of the campaign? What do they need to be doing to really bring this thing home?
Well, I mean, Joe's right. At this point, with a few weeks left, it's all getting out the vote and getting your base vote out. Like I said, and look, I'm not afraid to be critical, and I'm going to be a little bit critical of the Christy Smith campaign. This race should not be that close. She should be pulling out and pulling ahead. She should have won last time. This is a district that has one of the highest numbers of college-educated voters that is held by a Republican in Congress. It shares that commonality with a couple of the Orange County seats in California. The numbers, just the basic math demographically, would suggest that they should be in a better position that they're in. I think Christy Smith will win, but I think that they've got a hell of a lot of work to do to refine the tactical elements of their campaign going forward to preserve and protect that seat if Democrats are going to hold it, because the demographics, if not the partisanship, suggest that she should be in a better position. So at this point, the persuasion has largely been done. I think Garcia has done most of the damage to himself, frankly, and what truly his voting record and voting this way in a college-educated district makes no sense. It does in the rural part of Louisiana that you were talking about. It does in upstate New York. Does not make sense in the Santa Clarita Valley. He's just completely misreading it. He's gotten really bad advice. He's got either really bad instincts or he's not able to look past his own MAGA perspective of the world, and believes, I think erroneously, that the MAGA base can protect him in a district like this.
Yeah. If
Christy Smith hasn't closed the door with college-educated suburban women, then shame on them. But the biggest advocate for Christy Smith's cause is Mike Garcia.
So it's interesting. I'm going to really zero in on this for a second, and then I'll ask the more broad question. At the beginning of our conversation, I think it was Joe who said democracy's on the ballot. And I'm an engaged citizen. I have lots of conversations in my friend's backyard. And I've been saying since January 6th, this next election and elections thereafter, until further notice, are about democracy itself. And the fact that our representative voted to overturn duly, elections in Pennsylvania and Arizona, and has continued to talk about election security and bang this drum that Donald Trump would have scripted for him. But my friends in those backyards often will divert the conversation to, oh, well, did you see Joe Biden? And he's just talking about how old he is. And, they're basically regurgitating whatever Hannity's script was. So it seems maybe I'm friends with guys who are really ensconced in the Newsmax, Fox News world. But it does seem to me, it concerns me that they're not convinced that democracy is on the ballot. Any advice to guys like me, just regular engaged citizens, to really bring home that point that, listen, no, this is real. Like this whole democracy is not a given thing. This is real. Any advice for guys like me?
To convince those guys?
Yeah.
Well, an interesting poll came out about 3 weeks ago that showed that 67% of Americans believe that democracy was on the ballot. The funny thing about it was 67% of Democrats believed that was the case, and 67% of Republicans believed that was the case. And so it's not that they don't think that democracy is on the ballot, it's that their perception and their view of democracy is on the ballot and is threatened. One of my dearest friends is a Republican in that district, in your same district. We were having this debate down in Mike Garcia's district. And he said, I think that there's a threat to democracy too. It's just not coming from the Republicans, it's coming from the Democrats. And Democrats need to really understand that. And the reason why I say that is because you're not going to persuade anybody. We are not a country where there are undecideds, and Democrats have got to wake up and stop this idea of what they always do, this navel-gazing notion of like, let's try and figure out what the opposition thinks, and maybe we can use better arguments and convince them on policy or convince them that the American experiment is in jeopardy. No, stop it. Stop it. Best thing you can do is go register and turn out 18-year-olds who agree with you, who have a lower likelihood of showing up to turn out and vote. Play into the demographics. Quit trying to persuade people. You're not persuading anybody. There's nobody who's like, who's better on democracy, Republicans or Democrats? Like, I just don't know.
Right.
And that's what bothers me about the talking heads out there who are like, oh, democracy's on the ballot. It's like, everyone thinks democracy's on the ballot. Republicans and Democrats both think it's on the ballot. It's just a different version of what they believe democracy to be. So quit trying to convince your buddies. You're never going to convince them. Don't try to. Be smart. Go where the math is. Go fishing where the fish are, like I said last time, and that's how you win campaigns.
Yeah. It's interesting. You talked about the nature of Democratic voters, Democratic activists. And I'm just thinking about when your piece about Latino voters came out in the New York Times and the initial reaction you got. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it was your piece that was like that ignited a new conversation, but it's remarkable how many columns are coming out, how many conversations are being had about, where Latino voters are trending. So you did get a really good conversation started, despite what the initial reaction was. Yeah,
look, I started my career in Ventura County. My first congressional races were in Simi Valley to Ventura, the old 23rd congressional district. You're 22 now, so I've been involved politically in your part of the state. My sister, my mother lived in Simi Valley, right? Like they're right adjacent to where you're at. I've ran millions of campaigns in that part of the state. And I was watching Latino voters in the early 1990s. I've been watching this for some time. And I've been saying, like, if you think the Democrats have a hold on this community, you're just absolutely out of your mind. It's just not and now that it's happening nationally, I think there's this new awareness. Maybe we'll listen to that Mike Madrid guy. He's been saying this for a little bit of time, and maybe he's got something to say. And that's one of the challenges of being 20 years ahead of your time, I guess, is no one listens to you for 20 years. By the time they do, you're too old and it doesn't really matter anymore. But it is what it is. I'm not trying to be braggadocio. I'm just trying to remind voters for the first time who may be listening on the Latino vote, Democrats have really serious problems. That doesn't mean that the Republicans are going to win the Latino vote. They will not win in my lifetime. But if they're picking up 1 or 2 or 3% more every election cycle, that is going to have profound impacts on our democracy.
So we've been talking a lot about California 27, where I am. You mentioned California 22. I think that's another one of those key benchmark races, if you will. What maybe 3 to 5 House races will you be watching most closely that'll give you an indication as to which way this thing's going?
Well, I don't watch West Coast races because we'll already know basically what's going to happen, right? So you got to watch New York 19 again early on in election night. If you're looking for indications to get a sense of what's going to be happening in the country, you really need to look at
Spanberger's district in Virginia. The New York 19 is the one that with the special election.
Yeah, the North Carolina statewide race is very, very close. By the way, North Carolina is always leans a little bit more Democrat on in polling than it actually manifests on the ground. But if North Carolina is, if the Democrat wins North Carolina, and that's very possible
in the Senate.
Yeah.
Okay.
That means there's probably a very good night for Democrats. That's the real indicator you should be looking at. These House seats, I mean, they're going to be interesting, but the way they count, the way they come in are a little bit challenging. Again, look at New York 19. Yeah, I think that's probably North Carolina to me is always kind of a canary in the coal mine. How that breaks, the size of the break is going to tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah, interesting. This is such interesting stuff. I'm a longtime fantasy league geek. So now I'm a fantasy league geek with politics. So I love this stuff. So last question. Do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I want to know a little bit about your journey. I mean, when you started the podcast, we talked about this a little bit, I think a couple of times. I'd just like to keep checking in because you're very passionate and I think you're a very good ambassador for religion and faith in the public space at a time where we are polarized not just by race and party, but increasingly by religion. And you've seen me critical of some groups on social media because of that partisanship that has seeped into the faith community, which I think is destructive for communities of faith, first and foremost, but for the country secondarily. How would you launch this public discussion that you have started successfully again, knowing what you know now by leaning into the religion angle, argument, discussion?
I think there is, in some ways, the temperature of the water is even hotter than when I started. Because remember, I started this conversation, albeit on, very low profile, pre-2020 election. Just about a month before the 2020 election. So the heat has only been turned up a little bit, but when the heat is turned up, the conversation itself becomes more imperative. I'm one generation removed from Jews who lived in Ukraine when I think we've discussed this before, when the only thing that the Bolsheviks and the Cossacks and the Tsarists could agree on is they all hated the Jews.
Right.
Right. So if I think that I'm living in a time where it's fraught with really tense conversations, I just have to think about the stories that my grandmother told me about when she was a little girl in Ukraine. I have to remember the stories that I heard secondhand from the other part of our family that didn't leave Eastern Europe and was eviscerated in World War II and the Holocaust. So I just have to keep that in mind, not to compare myself to that, because again, like as fraught as these conversations are, when I go into just a one-on-one coffee with a buddy from that Bible study I described a little bit earlier, we can still have a coffee. We can still have a beer. There's still some folks, it takes a little bit of work for me to chip through and get them to come out to get together with me, because they've kind of hardened in their positions and made assumptions about the fact that I'm not a Fox News Trumpist, MAGA hat wearing kind of a guy, then I must be a socialist loving, tree hugging, critical race theory, all the labels that they want to put on me. And then, but once we get together, once we're seeing each other, our human faces in front of each other, then that humanity is allowed to come through, and I can't reach everybody, but when we allow for that space and create that space for each other to make a human connection, I think that that cuts through.
Mhm.
As much as they listen to Hannity or Will Cow or Ben Shapiro or whoever it is that they're listening to 20 hours a week, when I'm sitting in front of them and they're sitting in front of me, they're not that MAGA hat wearing guy. They're just my buddy who I'm having a beer with. And I think if there's any cure for what ails us currently, or what the many symptoms that we're experiencing right now, it's that. It's emphasizing the relational over the transactional, emphasizing the humanity of a person who has vast differences from me, who I walk into and he has the big old bumper sticker on his gun locker that says, come and take them, and I'm thinking, man, nobody's coming to take your Tinker toys, buddy.
Right.
But
Right.
he takes it like like, hey, now let's sit down and play some cards.
Right.
I think that's going to cut through and that's going to save us. So if you're asking whether I'd start it again, whether the stakes are higher or too high to have, I think the higher the stakes go, the more important it is to have these conversations and to pursue those human one-on-one relationships, because that's that's the salve that we need. I don't know if I'm answering your question directly.
No,
but
I mean, I love your passion and for this project. It's important. It's needed. And I guess what I was asking was, are you seeing anything hopeful? And what I'm hearing in your answer is yes.
It's in the one-on-ones. So a lot of us get frustrated when we think about the big picture and why do these people think these people, when we think in terms of those people, them, and the bigger problems and wanting it to be solved overnight, even on a big night, like when Biden won the election that night. Oh, we thought it's all over. It's not. But if we're looking for one degree for the temperatures to come down a little bit with one person, I think that's doable. That's when I'm more hopeful, is when I think about my buddy Darren, who we just got together for drinks a week ago, and we're so far apart in terms of who he thinks is the cause of a lot of the problems that ail our country versus what I think. So many differences. He's the guy with the big gun rack and, listening to Ben Shapiro all day, every day, but we get together and we're still just buds, we're pals. I'm not going to convince him to become, to vote for Christie, to your point.
Right.
He just ain't doing it. At best, maybe he just won't go out to vote this time around, but there's one degree of persuasion there. There's one degree of persuasion that, they're not all crazy. The people who aren't in his little circle. There's one degree of persuasion with one guy. And when that's my expectation and that's my goal, it's more realistic. I have control over the here and now with the person that's right in front of me. And the relationship pervades, the relationship trumps, if you will, everything else, all of the other noise. There's substance to that. There's nuance to that. There's humanity to that. And that's what keeps me going. That's what gives me some hope.
I mean, I appreciate, like I said, the passion for the project. It's great to talk to you. I'm glad we've developed a friendship too, because you're trying to do good in the world, man. And I want to see you succeed, brother.
I appreciate it. We got to do another dinner, maybe get Ron back. Ron was like, every time I talk to him, he's in, Paris. You guys went to Ukraine. He's in Australia. Yeah. Get him back to SoCal. Let's grab some dinner again, man.
He's all over the world, that guy. I love him dearly, but yeah, he's hard to track down.
Well, if for other folks, I mentioned Mic Drop and Latino Vote and just all the great work that you're doing. How can folks find you online and your shows and stuff like that?
Yeah, if you're interested in following me on Twitter, and I think you got a good sample of the things I think about and talk about pretty regularly. You can follow me on Twitter at Madrid_Mike, and then I do this on the Callin app, CALLIN. It's called Callin because you can call in and ask questions. It's called Mic Drop. Download the Callin app, or you can find it on anywhere else you get your podcast, Mic Drop. And then finally, if you're a real geek about the Latino vote, Chuck Rocha and I, who was a senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders campaign, obviously a progressive Democrat, myself a Republican, talk about the fight for the Latino vote. You can find that at the Latino Vote anywhere you get your podcasts.
Yeah, and just again, the folks already know about the Latino vote. We talked about it last time, and Chuck was on last time. But just to give another shout out to the new program, Mic Drop, man, it's super in depth. And unlike a lot of other call-in shows, your callers are really informed. You have some folks on there that have such intelligent questions, and you guys really do. the several episodes I've listened to all go over, a couple hours. So if you really want to get some insightful questions and informed, experienced people answering those questions, Mike is certainly the best of the best. So I can't vouch for it enough. So
Thank you. Mic drop is definitely not for beginners. It's for the kids who sit in the front row of class of politics and want to know deep down what's going on in a campaign. And we drill deep. So it's a fun conversation.
It's great. Well, thanks for coming in, Mike. And I can't wait to hang out with you again. And for listeners, as always, if you dig what we're doing here, hit the subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts. And like I said earlier, tell a friend about TPNR. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. And again, remember the dub. For whatever reason, I haven't figured out the digital side of it enough so that I'm cool enough to just get the politics and religion. But it's www.politicsandreligion.us. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the and spelled out, A-N-D. Politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us, by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.